When I set out to document the Famicom library, I gave myself some very firm boundaries. Commercially released, officially licensed, Famicom cartridges only. They gave me a rather firm list of things to cover. No chance of mission creep. It gave me an achievable target. However, there's a lot more software that you can run on your Famicom than that. Some things I talked about in either regular episodes of Famidaily, where I was cataloging the system's library, and in some cases I made some bonus videos about a few of the more significant things. But what else is there out there? Well, that's what this Appendix video is for. I'm going to quickly go through some of the other software released for the Famicom. In most of these cases, there really wasn't enough to justify its own video. Let's just consider this a look at the world beyond. I'm starting this off with one of the biggest sections, unlicensed releases. Broadly speaking, these fall into three categories: pirate carts, original-ish games, and homebrew. The difference between those last two categories is kind of fuzzy, but I'm considering it to be the difference between new games made for a market where this hardware was still in use, and intentional throwback games made by enthusiasts decades later. The pirate carts are nearly infinite in number. They basically crammed as many different ROM images onto one blobbed chip as they could, and sold them off cheap. It was rare that you found any games that actually used mappers on them, though as time went by, hacks and other options like that became more common for these. And of course, they had to tell you how many games they had on each cartridge, inflating the numbers hugely, essentially by randomizing a few bytes in every game. The quality of these cartridges is infamously poor, but for a lot of people around the world, this was how they could play video games. And these oddball, not very well thought out collections spread the joy of these 8-bit games to people who wouldn't have had any options otherwise. More interesting than those were the original games coming out of these caretaker publishing houses, often found in China or Taiwan. Some of these games were even released in Japan contemporary with the Famicom, particularly the AV series, which were porn games where you played a pretty bad version of some traditional game, like Hanafuda, and as you won, a woman got progressively more undressed. They're really not worth seeking out. While there were a few more totally original games, a common approach that quickly formed, especially as the 90s wore on, was to take a popular game of the time and try to port it back to the 8-bit hardware. Usually these turned out pretty poorly, but sometimes, just sometimes, the whole thing held together well enough that it was genuinely impressive that they managed to pull it off. And other times they just changed the sprites in another game to match the game they were trying to copy. Digging into these games would be a series unto itself. And then there's the recent round of homebrew software. Thanks to tools like Messmaker, it's relatively easy for anyone to make a game that will run on the Famicom. Though the trend started a few years before that even. In Japan, the Columbus Circle games even got distribution in regular department stores. That's right, in 2017 you could have gone out and bought a brand new Famicom game. These days they seem to be more dealing in reprints of old stuff, but from time to time they publish a homebrew game still. There's one more kind of exotic set of unlicensed Famicom games, and those are the ones released on cassette. And I mean audio cassette, not cartridges, which are called cassettes in Japan. These were basic programs, and I mean basic the programming language, that you could load up from tape to Family Basic, and then play them that way. There were also Family Basic programs that were printed in magazines, and users would have to type these in themselves. And that's the unlicensed games. There's a lot of them. Many of them aren't very good, but you will find some gems out there. When I say commercially released, I mean that someone in Japan could have gone out to their local store, picked a copy of these games off the shelf, and paid their yen to take it home. For a variety of reasons, though, there were quite a few officially licensed Famicom cartridges where you couldn't do that. The ones that are the most common are the pack-ins. In the very, very early days of the Famicom, Sharp Electronics obtained a license to make their own versions of the system. And they made quite a few Famicom variants. They had ones built into TVs, ones with the Famicom disk system attached, and ones that looked like a regular computer. These Sharp Famicoms all came with some kind of software. Because Sharp was the first out the door with their keyboard variant of the Famicom, they got the first version of Family Basic. This is why the version that you'll find with Nintendo's Famicom keyboard is version 2. Sharp would actually release their own version of the standalone Famicom keyboard as well, and the version of BASIC that came with that was called Playbox BASIC, which was version 1.0, except it had some additional software like a music player. The other cartridge that Sharp gave away with their Famicoms was a combination cartridge for Donkey Kong Jr. and Donkey Kong Jr. Math. Presumably they brought those two games together because they could reuse some of the sprites. Still, it's not exactly the most thrilling of pack-ins. Another category of official cartridges that weren't commercially released are the contest giveaways. I talked about these in the appropriate Famidaily episodes, but the two most significant ones, as in the ones that you might actually find and purchase, are the gold Punch-Out cartridges that don't have Mike Tyson on them, and the Archimedes version of Gradius, which replaced the power-ups with packages of noodles. There was another unusual giveaway with the Zeta Gundam Hot Scramble game. The final version was actually an early beta that was given away to 1,000 people, and the version released to stores was a dramatically different and much worse game. Then there were the official cartridges that were not commercially released. Some of these were because they were intended for internal use by some company. Product tailor-made was software to be used in a bicycle store to let customers design their own special bicycle. Yasda Fire and Marine Safety Rally was a program created for an insurance company to teach people safe operation of vehicles. Those two are extremely hard to find, but a more common one of these was Family School, a program by a life insurance company that was made to teach kids about planning for their future. You'd get a question, and then you'd have to grow a plant and push the seed into the appropriate bin for your answer. Of all of these non-commercially available games, that's the one that you could possibly afford, since it was a giveaway and copies are usually about 6,000 yen these days. For the other cartridges in this section, if you have to ask how much it costs, you can't afford it. Famicom has a 60-pin edge connection slot, and for my catalog, I mostly stuck to things that plugged into that. There were a couple items that got on my list that didn't match that, but that's a tiny fraction. The reason I set this limitation is that there are a lot of Famicom add-ons out there, which let people load software other ways. And in the case of two of them, most of the software is lost media. The most significant of these expansion platforms is the Famicom Disk System, Nintendo's own way of loading a different kind of media onto the Famicom. I'm not going to get too deep into that, because I'm about to start a series all about the disk system. But there were other options. There were a handful of semi-official cassette releases. Since Hudson was the company that made Family Basic, their cassette games for it, I think, can be reasonably considered an expansion. They also released an expansion pack for Lode Runner this way. Hudson wasn't the only one to have official releases on tape, though. Behold the Study Box, an educational system that you had to subscribe to, and every month a new cassette with a new lesson would be mailed to you. Over 100 lessons existed, and most of them are lost media. Another educational hardware expansion was Konami's Famicom Kai Gakken adapter, or the Q-Tai. Rather than being sold in stores, this was a joint project between Konami and Japanese broadcaster NHK to put educational software in schools. There were around a dozen releases for it, and 4 are still known to exist. In case you couldn't tell, people weren't great about preserving these educational materials. The Turbo File was a device that provided the Famicom with external memory for saving games, and since the device was made by ASCII, it was mostly ASCII games that supported it. The lesser-known function of the Turbo File was that there was a cartridge port on it. and you could mail order roster updates for ASCII's statistics-based strategic baseball game Best Play Pro Yaku. Copies of this add-on are absurdly rare, to the point where there are only 2 copies known to exist. And that brings me to the last possible expansion, cartridge expansions, where the cartridge itself allowed you to plug something into it. Nantatate Baseball, for example, had a big slot on the back where you could plug in roster updates for each year. They released 2 of these pretty quickly after the game was released, and that was it. And finally, there's Karaoke Studio, a cartridge so strangely shaped, I thought it was an adapter at first. But there is a full game on there, and it plugs into the Famicom's slot. However, it has its own slots, and 2 expansions that added more songs to the game were released. At least they were 8-bit renditions of popular songs at the time, though honestly, I don't think I'm familiar with any of them. So there's a very quick look at the things that weren't included in Famidaily. And I suspect you'll agree that there were pretty good reasons for not including most of those. It does serve as a reminder, though, that when you start drilling down into a topic like the Famicom, something that was a cultural force in its day, and still remains so, that there's always more out there. There's always something else to find out or try. That's what makes it so much fun,